Hello friends, so we're just going to continue with Better Covenant Theology and looking at the remaining 6 pillars that Better Covenant Theology stands on. So number 5, the complete destruction of Jerusalem's temple in AD 70 finally removed the Old Covenant and fulfilled Hebrews chapter 8 verse 13. And Hebrews 8:13 reads, "In speaking of a new covenant, he makes the first one obsolete, and what is becoming obsolete and growing old is ready to vanish away." So some people may not be even aware that the temple was destroyed in AD 70, so we will unpack that a little bit further in future videos. So number 6, between the cross and AD 70, there was a violent 40-year covenant transition period. And again, we need to unpack that for some people that are not familiar with what was happening in the early church. So that 40-year period, remember in Matthew 24, Jesus says, this generation is talking about the generation that was alive at the time when Moses came out of Egypt and the children walked around in the wilderness for 40 years. A generation passed away. It's the same concept within AD 30 when Jesus was crucified to AD 70. There is a wilderness 40-year period where the generation that didn't believe would end up being destroyed in AD 70. A bigger concept to unpack in a future video. So number 7, the Old and New Covenant coexisted for 40 years. That's AD 70 to AD 40. During that first 40 years of the early church, the Hebrews, the Jewish people, were carrying on. Jesus had been crucified, he'd risen from the dead. There was this new group of people, but the temple system and the sacrifices were carrying on. You remember when Jesus was crucified, the veil that divided the Holy of Holies was ripped in two from the top to the bottom, exposing that every person could see into the Holy of Holies and come into the presence of God. The Sanhedrin, the Pharisees, Sadducees patched it up again, and so they continued to do the Old Covenant even though it had been put aside. Number 8, the end of the age and the last days are first century references to the last days of the Old Covenant and the end of the Mosaic age. So in the next group of videos coming up, we're going to talk about the words that are used and translated: end of the age, end of the world, last days, etc. So we will cover those off in later videos. And number 9, there is no current application for the Mosaic kinship and vassal covenants. The feasts, the Sabbath, circumcision, and so-called civil, ceremonial, and moral laws have all been done away with. You remember when we looked at covenants, we talked about the Mosaic covenant. The first part of it was a kinship covenant. When Joshua took over, he became a vassal covenant. And then there was a whole heap of laws added on top of the laws for keeping people actually away from God. Again, another big topic that we can unpack at a later date. And number 10, the new covenant has one law. It's the law, love one another as I have loved you. And you will recall, if you're familiar with your scriptures, the Jewish people had the law of love the Lord thy God with all your heart, soul, and mind, and love others as yourself. Jesus increased that law, that requirement of that law in Gospel of John, love one another as I have loved you. That's a much higher level of love than just loving others like you love yourself. So those are the 10 pillars of Better Covenant Theology, and as I say, we need to unpack those a little bit further in future videos. Bless you heaps.